since we've had the Climate Vulnerability Monitor come out in 2010, and we've in recent days we're seeing the IPCC report on extreme weather coming out. What's the impacts that you're seeing on vulnerable countries around the world already?
Well, I mean, the impact's already large scale, hundreds of thousands of deaths, mainly due to health problems and mainly among children, places like Africa, South Asia, where we are now, Bangladesh, and in the Pacific, small island developing states. Impacts very significant in intensity in what we call highly vulnerable countries. So, for instance, economic impacts related to sea level rise will range from microscopic percentage points of GDP in countries where, you know, they're well equipped to deal with it, or environmentally their vulnerability is less. And small low-lying islands of the Pacific, it basically destroys the whole economy. And on average, you can have percentage points of GDP that calculate into, you know, 4% per average economic losses per year already now for the Pacific, for instance. So it's a very real situation. I mean, at the moment we had, for instance, here Tuvalu, Kiribati, Pacific Island countries that are suffering from extreme drought on the top of you know, the fact that they get inundated by tidal waves from just spring tides. You know, when you have 3 meters elevation, like was referred to by Ban Ki-moon in the conference today. You know, you don't have much margin vis-a-vis the environment around you, and that relates to, you know, all sorts of things like the freshwater lens that's underneath many of the islands. It basically gets penetrated by salt because of the, you know, the increasing surges of salt water that come through. I mean, generally just a massive range of impacts, but I think the main thing is that, you know, Cancun was basically a year ago now. That was what at the time was already 1 year into kind of fast start financing that we're talking about. That was a commitment made by developed countries to take some sort of responsibility for the industrialization and the effects of that industrialization process. Now 2 years into it, we realize that the $30 billion commitment, only $2.5 billion roughly has actually been dispersed, and there's 1 year left. And worse, there is absolute clarity on the fact that there is no finance promised from the years 2013 to the end of year 2019. So basically, what it looks like is happening is that climate finance, well, if it's currently dispersed at this rate, it will still be being dispersed in 2029. So there's a lot of fear and worry that that's about it. And the process is neither in the negotiations very encouraging, with major industrialized nations looking to be out of a second commitment period to the Kyoto Protocol, with no parallel global agreement in sight. That would send the worst possible signals to the business community. It would wreck basically the market potentially for the clean development mechanism. I think what these countries were very clear on here this week was that there must be a continuation of some form to the Kyoto Protocol. There must be no gap between a first commitment period and a second commitment period. Another thing I think that comes out of the briefing notes that were distributed to the delegations is that the Climate Vulnerable Forum, who reiterated their 1.5 degrees Celsius target, recalling that it was in 2009 in November when President Mohamed Nasheed first convened the Climate Vulnerable Forum, that they were the original ones to agree to a 1.5 degrees Celsius target and also 350 ppm. And subsequently it was AOSIS that took up that position as well. The Climate Vulnerable Forum today firmly reiterated the call for 1.5 degrees, so looking at the 2015 revision of that temperature target. And I think what comes out of the briefing notes is that, you know, it's still highly possible. It looks tough and it's certainly going to be challenging, but one of the key things to making this happen is the international partnership that has to form between developed countries and developing countries. I mean, you have vulnerable countries, and, you know, literally there are 18, 19 here at the Climate Vulnerable Forum, but they will go back to their regions where they have neighboring countries who didn't participate, not because of ill will or lack of interest, but just because we're not convening here a parallel United Nations. We're convening a group of interested parties who are broadly representative, and their neighbours amount to literally over 100 countries around the world who are in the same situation. They cannot access the technology to transition to the low carbon economy. They don't have basically the resources necessary, financing costs in many of these countries due to country risk, inflationary pressures, and business risks basically mean that when you develop the kind of large-scale businesses that are involved in energy projects, etc., that it becomes a lot more expensive, and it's a lot more difficult for these types of countries to pursue that track. So there's a strong will, and I think it comes out in the declaration that was adopted today, that vulnerable countries want to pursue adamantly low carbon development. It's just there's only so much they can do on their own, and they're doing quite a bit. Bangladesh, for instance, has committed out of its budget $300 million of Bangladesh taxpayer money to their climate change strategy, which includes a low carbon development plan. But that's quite a commitment for a least developed country whose foreign ministry contains 200 employees. I come from New Zealand. I think the population of Bangladeshis living outside of Bangladesh is double the size of New Zealand. And I would wonder what our foreign ministry, which accomplishes a lot and is a very good foreign ministry. But anyway, the capacity is a major concern. So if they're going to be able to do this, they need to be able to benefit from that technology and that financing commitment that's been made by developed countries. And the gigaton gap that does exist, provided that we do come to a global agreement based on the Copenhagen commitments that are there now. We're looking at projecting to about 49 gigatons of CO2 equivalent by 2020. If we're going to hit 1.5 degrees Celsius, roughly, the projection made by the UNEP report, we need to be more like 39. So we've got 10 gigatons of CO2 that we need to cut. But there's a lot that can be done on basic things like agreeing very strict rules on land use and forestry. There's work to be done on basically financing will account for millions of gigatons are equivalent of so several gigatons of CO2 reduction. That is not factored into those Copenhagen commitments, the best ones. So that will calculate additional gigatons, and eventually we can close the gap. But one of the key things will be this financing, because that will stimulate basically very low-cost emission reductions around the world. The CDM, if it operated more effectively, would also provide gigaton reductions. If we regulate on top of that so-called bunker fuels, which are basically aircraft and marine emissions that are not under the current Kyoto framework, then basically we're there. We're at 1.5 degrees. But the key thing, a couple of key decisions need to be made, and one of those is the financing. And so the default on the financing that is happening and the absolute abandon on any form of transparency whatsoever, basically it is in a large degree, or it cannot at least be said that it isn't, simply transfer of official development assistance that would otherwise have been intended for poverty reduction efforts to so-called fast start climate finance that is actually being spent 10 times slower than it would have been spent if it had been normal ODA for poverty reduction. So it's a complete loss on all fronts, and it's a travesty, in fact, and I think that's why our trustee, the former president of Costa Rica, Jose Maria Figueres, talked of insult, because that's what it is. Here you have a group of countries, a large group of countries that also represent potentially many like-minded countries in their region. So a large proportion of the world, in effect, taking leadership and doing what they can. But there needs to be the international partnership involved in order to make that happen. And I think part of what the initiative is achieving is a higher degree of accountability, because there's a lot of grey area. You'd be surprised that very few of the delegations have been able to have a very clear idea on what the financing situation is, because they'll go into a donor presentation and the European Union will tell them that they've pledging just 8 billion euros or dollars to the fast up financing. Fine, okay, across countries like the UK and France and Germany, etc. But in effect, what's happened is that those resources are getting stuck in 20 different funds, bilateral arrangements that we have no transparency on what is actually going on in there. And in the end, the current rate of dispersal will have us seeing it, dispersed up until 2029. So, I mean, yeah, okay, there are pledges and there is money that is being deposited, but also out of the 30 billion that's been pledged, only 14.5 billion of that is actually being firmly committed, in the sense that governments, including governments of the EU, for instance, have taken fiscal or legal steps to actually separate those resources out from being spent on other things. So basically 2 years into a 3-year period, we can only say that less than half of the pledged money, so what was pledged at Copenhagen, for instance, has actually been set aside for this purpose. And then a fraction of that amount actually being spent in countries or on projects.
Why is it, though, do you think, if we've got climate impacts becoming more and more severe, we've got a clear message from the countries here that this is a huge problem for them, and yet we seem to have rich countries doing little, if nothing? It's almost insulting how little they're doing. What's going wrong?
Well, I mean, the conditions are not easy. There's an economic downturn, obviously. That doesn't make it easier. I think, frankly, there needs to be a little bit of honesty. I think the biggest concern is just that, there is a default going on, and there's a lack of recognition of that. And that, there needs to be a recognition that there's a default. I think people would be understanding of the situation. At the same time, there must be a living up to the commitments. I mean, we know that this level of financing is not adequate anyway. I mean, in terms of the impacts of climate change, I think the Environment Minister of Bangladesh calculated that they need $10 billion at the moment just for Bangladesh. There's one country. We had 19 here today. There's hundreds of others. So, I mean, that's, I'm not sure what the time period of those resources were. On average, major international studies have pitched adaptation financing at 50 billion globally. So, these resources are all too low. I mean, the other problem is, I mean, there is a big political picture globally that a lot of America, for instance, has no hope in terms of, at this stage, at least in terms of on the horizon, of committing to anything serious in terms of emission reductions. So that puts many of the other developed countries in a difficult position because they're going it alone. Russia is in a very different situation than it was after the collapse of the Soviet Union, when its heavy industry was disappeared in a matter of months and years, and basically all their emission reductions were already accomplished before they even signed onto the Kyoto Protocol. China is at this stage probably the only developing country that is going to exceed a mean per capita pollution level at 2020. So that's like, for instance, if we want to be at 1.5 degrees with a population that's going to be about 7.7 billion in 2020, we need to be polluting roughly 5.1 tons of CO2 per capita. China will be on current trajectory at 10. India will be at 2. So there's a huge difference between developing countries. But I mean, China seems to be moving in the right direction. They are investing already double in volume what America does on greening their economy, triple the amount of GDP. I think there is a sea change going on, and we're living that. And I think, part of the story, a couple of years ago, you wouldn't have had these countries adopting this declaration, basically. The first CVF declaration was already quite compelling, but this group has almost doubled since then, and I think the interest is even wider.
And how's it going to play out in the UN negotiations, which are coming up in later in this month? How do you think the alliance between these countries and the discussions between these countries will play out there?
Well, I'm not sure if we're calling it an alliance at this stage, more like a group of like-minded of countries who are faced with similar challenges and want to achieve similar outcomes. it is a forum, not an organisation. It's a non-binding group of countries, so there's no legal commitment for them to follow up one way or another. But there is that will is there, and the energy of I think these last few days have been a testament to that. And of course, the encouragement of the Secretary General was a major element. How it will play out, there's certainly going to be wider consultation. We're going to, Bangladesh and DARA in support of Bangladesh is certainly going to help take this declaration to Durban in a big way, and all of the CVF countries will ultimately fan out across their different negotiating groups and regional groups, and there's going to be a presentation about what went on, what the talks were, and what the reasoning was that led us to that declaration here in Dhaka, and why the countries here feel it was so important, those points. And I think there's a lot of alignment. I mean, generally, even when you look, for instance, at the recent BASIC meeting, I mean, a number of the things are common anyway, like the significance of needing to ensure a second commitment period of Kyoto, the lack of transparency and the need for accountability on finance. So I think there'll be a lot of resonance in Durban for the kind of messages that have come out of here.
You talk about the alignment with BASIC. There's also kind of some tensions. What's the relationship between the Climate Vulnerable Forum, these kind of group of countries that are the most vulnerable, and countries like China and India, who often try and position themselves alongside these vulnerable countries, but actually kind of exist in very different contexts? Do you think they'll be working together, or are they going to increasingly be challenging these major emitters to begin reducing their own emissions?
Well, it's a different, every single country is probably a different perspective. I think a lot of the Climate Vulnerable Forum was reassured by a very interested, favourable statement of the People's Republic of China that was given during the Common Space here, looking to engage in South-South cooperation and support vulnerable countries. And I think, there's a lot of goodwill that exists. I mean, countries like India are ultimately in, quite similar situation to many of these vulnerable countries as well, if on a bigger scale, and it is a much larger economy, and therefore they have a larger capacity to respond. I think, it really depends country to country, but generally, I mean, the G77. I think it's almost every CVF country is a member of the G77 by just a handful, and I think the CVF is a good thing for the G77 as well. It's ultimately increasing the level of accountability in a way, and it's it's spreading the the low carbon development wider, or it's hoping to at least, and it hopes to succeed on that, and eventually that will be a breakthrough to the green future, which is above all important for developing countries who are drastically, disproportionately affected by this problem, and increasingly so. I mean, India, China, I mean, heavy impacts, particularly in India. Yeah.
Thanks very much for speaking to us. We'll look forward to the Climate Vulnerable Monitor coming out next year.
Excellent. Thanks a lot.